In October of 2023, inside a federal courtroom in Alabama, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades at the center of one of America's most haunting missing person cases agreed to do something he had resisted for years: give a full account of what he said happened to Natalee Holloway. If you followed this story back in 2005, you remember how it felt. A teenager vanishes on a graduation trip. A tropical island becomes a search grid. The world watches every rumor, every press conference, every shaky lead, every contradiction. And the name that never goes away is Joran van der Sloot. But here's the uncomfortable truth about this case. Even now, the statement that finally arrived came without the one thing that could close the door completely. Natalee's body has never been found, and the investigation, despite years of attention, still leaves behind a trail of questions about what was real evidence, what was noise, what was missed, and what may never be recovered. So tonight, we're going to do this carefully. We're going to walk through the timeline, the confirmed facts, the contradictions, and the moments where this case forked into multiple possibilities. We'll talk about what investigators could prove, what they suspected, what they couldn't corroborate, and why the story of Natalee Holloway became more than a single disappearance. It became a lesson in how modern true crime narratives form in real time, with real stakes and real consequences for a family living inside the world's attention. And I want to say this up front. This story is about Natalee first, an 18-year-old on the edge of her life beginning, a daughter, a friend, a student who should have come home. If you're here for careful, source-based true crime, where we separate what's confirmed from what's alleged, consider subscribing now, because by the end of this episode I'm going to lay out the 3 most plausible pathways investigators faced in 2005, and then compare them to what changed in 2023, and what still didn't. Now, before we go back to Aruba, we need a single anchor point. One question that guides everything. What happened in the hours after Natalee Holloway left a nightclub in Oranjestad in the early morning of May 30th, 2005? That question has lived for 20 years. It has pulled in law enforcement across borders. It has fueled media cycles. It has attracted scams, false tips, and people looking for profit. And it has kept a mother and a father in a kind of suspended grief that is hard to describe unless you've watched it up close. But we can start where the story was still simple. Natalee Holloway was an 18-year-old from Mountain Brook, Alabama, traveling with classmates to Aruba to celebrate graduating high school. It was the kind of trip a lot of families see as a final exhale, one last celebration before life splits into colleges, jobs, new cities, new identities. She was staying at the Holiday Inn in Aruba with her group, and on the night she disappeared, she went out with friends to Carlos and Charlie's, a popular club in Oranjestad. Those details matter because they establish something important. This wasn't a person drifting away from her life. This was a teenager on a structured trip, surrounded by peers, in a place that felt safe enough to celebrate. Whatever happened after that would have to overcome a basic reality. She had a flight home. She had a schedule. She had people expecting her. And then, on the last day of the trip, she didn't show up. In the earliest hours after a disappearance, investigators typically try to answer 3 questions fast. Did the person leave voluntarily? Did the person have an accident? Or did someone else make a decision for them? In Natalee's case, what made those questions immediately complicated was the last scene detail. Because multiple reports, and later multiple official summaries, centered on a specific moment, Natalee leaving the bar with a small group of local young men, including Joran van der Sloot, in a gray Honda. That detail shows up again and again in the timeline, because once a person is last seen entering a private vehicle late at night, the investigation becomes less about broad searching, and more about narrowing down who knows what. And from the beginning, Joran van der Sloot's story never sat still. Over time, different accounts would surface, some attributed to him, some attributed to others, some filtered through interviews, prosecutors, or media. Early on, one version was that Natalee had been dropped off at her hotel. But surveillance footage did not show her returning to the Holiday Inn that night. That mismatch between "I brought her back" and "she never arrived" became the first major contradiction that planted itself in the public mind. And once a contradiction like that exists, everything becomes a tug-of-war between 2 forces. One force is evidence: cameras, phone records, witness statements, physical searches, timelines. The other is storytelling, the human impulse to fill gaps, connect dots, and choose a narrative that makes the chaos feel coherent. This case became a global story partly because it lived right at that intersection. There was enough information to feel close, but not enough to answer the central question. As the disappearance gained attention, local authorities arrested van der Sloot and the Kalpo brothers, Deepak and Satish, in June 2005 on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. But within months, they were released without charges. That pattern: arrest, release, renewed interest, dead end, would repeat in later years, feeding the perception that something was being hidden, mishandled, or simply impossible to prove. Here's a question I want you to hold on to as we move through the timeline. When an investigation doesn't end in charges, is it because the suspects are innocent, or because the evidence was never strong enough to survive court? That question isn't just philosophical. It changes how you interpret everything that comes next. And it also changes how you interpret the role of Aruba itself. Aruba is a small island with a tourism economy. In 2005, the disappearance of an American teenager on a high-profile trip created international pressure instantly. Suddenly, local law enforcement wasn't just investigating, they were performing under a spotlight. Every day that passed without answers wasn't just painful for told and untold reasons, it was also a threat to the island's image, and therefore its livelihoods. That kind of environment can create urgency. It can also create friction, defensiveness, and mistakes. In the weeks after Natalee vanished, the search expanded in layers. And with each layer, the public was offered another possible ending. Some tips pointed toward the ocean. Some tips pointed toward the desert-like interior. Some tips pointed toward landfills. At one point, searches included draining or partially draining bodies of water after witnesses or informants claimed something had been seen or done. Each new search area generated hope, then disappointment, and those repeated emotional cycles became part of what traumatized the family and anyone following the story with sincerity. And here's the other reality. A case with worldwide attention attracts people who want to insert themselves into it. Some people want to be helpful. Some people want to be seen. Some people want money. That last part becomes crucial later, because this case eventually drew a very specific kind of predator, someone who knows grief can be exploited, and someone who understands that the absence of answers is a market. But we're not there yet. We're still in 2005, and in 2005, the central pressure point was Joran van der Sloot. The reason he remained the central figure wasn't because he was convicted of anything related to Natalee. He wasn't. It was because he was the last person publicly identified as having been with her. And once you're last known, every inconsistency becomes magnified. Every timeline shift becomes suspicious. Every new version of events becomes a potential confession or a potential lie. In February of 2006, van der Sloot flew to New York for an interview, and in that interview, he claimed he left Natalee on the beach and went home. That detail matters because it sets a public record, a version of events he was willing to say out loud in a mainstream interview environment. But even then, the core problem remained the same. No evidence of Natalee after the club, and no confirmed trail leading back to safety. So let's slow down and do what a good investigator does. Let's reconstruct the last night in a way that clarifies what is known, what is likely, and what is unknown. The known part begins at Carlos and Charlie's. Natalee is out with classmates. The night is about celebration and transition. And like many vacations, especially for teenagers, the boundaries between safe fun and risky situation can blur because the environment is unfamiliar and people assume nothing truly bad will happen in a place designed to feel like escape. At some point in the early morning, Natalee leaves the club. According to the timeline later summarized publicly, she is seen leaving with a group of local young men and driving away in a gray Honda. This is the last confirmed sighting that gets repeated in the most authoritative public summaries of the case. After that, the story becomes a series of competing narratives. One narrative says she was dropped off at her hotel. Another narrative says she was left on a beach. Another narrative says there was an accident. Another narrative says there was violence. Another narrative suggests involvement by more than one person. And one of the reasons those narratives were able to compete for so long is because there was no body and no single piece of physical evidence that forced one version to dominate. So how do investigators decide what to chase? They chase inconsistencies. They chase opportunities for corroboration. They chase the places where a liar's story breaks against something objective. A camera, a timestamp, a bank transaction, a phone ping. The surveillance detail, Natalee not being captured returning to the Holiday Inn, was one of those objective points. It didn't prove what happened, but it made at least one early version harder to defend. And once that happened, attention narrowed. The gray Honda became important. Who drove it? Where did it go? Who was with her? Where were their phones? Who saw them after? What did the friends of those men say later, privately, when their lives weren't being watched by cameras? In a case like this, investigators will often try to separate the group from the individual, because groups can create shared stories. Individuals can crack, but that requires time, leverage, and sometimes evidence that pressures someone into cooperation. And from what we can see in public timelines, that pressure never produced a prosecutable case in 2005. Now, as we move forward, I want to be precise about language. Joran van der Sloot was widely described as the main suspect or prime suspect in the disappearance. He was arrested and released. He was not convicted of any crime related to Natalee Holloway. The Calpo brothers were also arrested and released. They were not convicted in connection with her disappearance. But not convicted does not equal cleared, and cleared does not equal we know what happened. That space, the gap between legal proof and public belief, is where this case lived for years. If you were watching back then, you remember the frenzy. It felt like new information daily. But with the benefit of distance, we can see that a lot of that new information was actually repetition, amplification, and sometimes rumor. And in the middle of it was a family forced to become public. Beth Holloway, Natalee's mother, became one of the most visible faces of a missing child case in modern American media. Her persistence mattered for the investigation, but it also made her a target. There's a moment in long-running cases where a family faces a brutal choice. Do we keep pushing, knowing hope can be exploited, or do we step back and accept that the world will move on even if we can't? In this case, Beth Holloway did not move on, and that choice, over time, brought her into contact with one of the darkest elements of the true crime ecosystem, the person who offers closure in exchange for money. In March of 2010, 5 years after Natalee disappeared, Vandersloot allegedly demanded a large sum of money from Beth Holloway in exchange for information about the location of her daughter's remains. Prosecutors later described a recorded sting operation in which a payment was made and information was provided that was ultimately described as worthless. The details are important because they reveal a pattern, the repeated use of shifting stories not just to avoid accountability, but to extract value from grief. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Vandersloot solicited money on promises he would reveal the location of Natalee's remains and the circumstances of her death. After being paid, he later described the information he provided as worthless. Years later, that would become the basis of federal charges for extortion and wire fraud. But here's why 2010 matters beyond the money. Because within days of that alleged scheme, Vandersloot left Aruba for Peru. And on May 30, 2010, exactly 5 years to the day after Natalee vanished, he killed 21-year-old Stephanie Flores in Lima, Peru, in a crime for which he was later convicted. That coincidence of dates doesn't prove anything about 2005 on its own, but it shaped public perception deeply because it reinforced a fear, the idea that the person long suspected in Natalee's disappearance was capable of lethal violence. And for many observers, that became the emotional tipping point. If he could kill Stephanie Flores, then the question became, what did he do in Aruba? But careful analysis requires we separate emotional logic from evidentiary logic. The fact of the Peru conviction tells us something important about capacity and pattern. It does not, by itself, prove what happened to Natalee in 2005. That said, the 2010 extortion allegation and the later federal case are relevant to Natalee's story because they show how the mystery itself became currency. And that is something we need to understand because it affects how we evaluate later statements, including the 2023 account. If someone has a documented history of giving worthless information when it benefits them, what does that do to their credibility when they later claim to offer the full truth? Hold on to that. Now let's return again to 2005 and ask, what were the plausible paths investigators faced at the time? There are 3 broad categories that have always hovered over this case. First, accidental death after leaving the club. Second, violence leading to death, whether impulsive or intentional. Third, a complex scenario involving multiple people, concealment, or movement of a body. Each category contains sub-possibilities, but these are the big buckets. And to assess them, we have to look at what is known about the last hours. In public reconstructions, the beach version appears early. It has a logic. Tourists go to beaches. It's plausible a group would drive to a quieter area. It's plausible someone intoxicated could wander into water and drown. It's plausible an accident could happen in darkness with alcohol involved. But plausibility is not proof, and a drowning scenario still has questions. If it was accidental, why the shifting stories? Why not call for help? Why not bring attention immediately? Why would multiple versions exist at all? Accidental deaths often generate panic and bad decisions, yes. But the volume and variety of contradictions in this case made many investigators and observers lean away from pure accident. Then there's violence. In later years, Vandersloot provided multiple accounts of what allegedly happened. In one version described by prosecutors in connection with the 2010 extortion case, he claimed Natalee fell and hit her head on a rock after he threw her down. That version frames an accident inside a violent act. It's the kind of story a guilty person sometimes chooses because it reduces the moral weight. It wasn't murder, it was a terrible accident. But again, we have to be careful. We are talking about accounts that were not corroborated by physical evidence and were given by someone with clear incentive to manipulate the story. This is where I want to ask you something directly. When you hear a suspect's story change repeatedly, do you see that as proof of deception? Or do you see it as proof of pressure, fear, and confusion? There's no single correct answer, because both can happen. But your instinct will shape how you interpret everything we cover next. Leave a comment with your honest take, even if it's messy. Do shifting stories automatically equal guilt to you? Or do you think there are circumstances where an innocent person can become inconsistent under intense scrutiny? Now, as years passed, the case entered a phase that many missing person investigations enter, the long stretch where public attention fades, but the family's life does not. In January 2012, an Alabama judge declared Natalee Holloway legally dead. That declaration is not the same as solving the case. It's a legal recognition of reality, an acknowledgement that time has passed without answers, and that the family needs the ability to handle legal, financial, and personal matters that can't stay frozen forever. But emotionally, it's a different kind of loss. It's a line drawn by a court through the center of a family's hope. And even after that declaration, the story did not end, because new content kept appearing. New tapes, new claims, new sources. One of the most infamous moments in this case's public timeline is the hidden camera footage recorded by Dutch crime reporter Peter R. de Vries, which showed Van der Sloot describing Natalee's death. Aruban officials reopened the case after that tape surfaced, but publicly noted they could not corroborate his statements. That's a key phrase, could not corroborate, because it's possible to have a confession and still not have a prosecutable case. A confession can be false. A confession can be exaggerated. A confession can be partially true and partially constructed. A confession can be crafted to impress someone, manipulate someone, or control a narrative. And in this case, for years, the pattern was the same. A statement appears, attention spikes, investigators chase the statement, and then the statement collapses under verification. So what do we do with the fact that, in 2023, Van der Sloot again provided an account, this time in the context of a federal plea agreement? We don't dismiss it, but we don't swallow it whole. We measure it against the patterns of the past. In June of 2023, Van der Sloot was temporarily extradited to the United States to face charges tied to the 2010 scheme. And on October 18, 2023, he pleaded guilty to extortion and wire fraud, receiving a 20-year sentence in federal prison, to run concurrently with his existing sentence in Peru. According to the Department of Justice, part of the plea agreement involved his commitment to provide full, complete, accurate, and truthful information regarding Natalee Holloway's disappearance. That's the moment the public had waited for, a legal structure designed to force answers. And in the timeline later summarized publicly, Van der Sloot described a scenario on a beach where, after being resisted, he assaulted Natalee and used a cinder block, then pushed her body into the ocean. This is where we need to pause for a moment of respect. We can talk about what was said without turning Natalee's suffering into a spectacle. We don't need graphic detail. We don't need to linger. We just need to acknowledge what was claimed and what it means. The claim, if true, would answer the central question. But the claim does not automatically become fact simply because it was spoken. It must be weighed against the record. So let's do that. Let's evaluate what parts of his 2023 account align with known constraints and what parts remain unverifiable. Constraint number 1. Natalee did not appear on hotel surveillance returning to the Holiday Inn. A scenario where she never returns fits that. Constraint number 2. She was last seen leaving with Van der Sloot and others in a gray Honda. A scenario where she ends up away from her hotel fits that. Constraint number 3. Her body has never been recovered. A scenario involving the ocean fits the absence of remains, especially in a coastal environment. So on a surface level, the 2023 account fits the broad outline of what has always been possible. But possible isn't the same as proven. We have to ask, is there anything in his 2023 account that can be independently checked? In many cases, details can be checked by geography, by timing, by whether the path described makes sense, by whether people could have seen what he says happened, by whether the physical environment matches. However, in a case this old, on a beach at night, with no body recovered, the ability to verify is limited. That's why the 2023 statement, even if accepted by a judge as part of a plea agreement context, still leaves behind the fundamental limitation. It does not create a murder conviction in Aruba, and it does not produce physical closure. And according to reporting, Aruban authorities have continued to treat the case as an open investigation, requesting documentation from the U.S. proceedings and reviewing what procedural steps might still be available. This is where legal reality becomes part of the mystery. There may be statute of limitations complications in Aruba. There are jurisdiction limits for the U.S. There is a concurrent sentencing structure with Peru. Even when someone speaks, the legal system may not be able to use those words to fully resolve the case in court. Now, I want to talk about contradictions because you mentioned something important. His story was filled with contradictions, and the investigation revealed multiple possibilities. That's true, and it's also why this case stayed alive in public consciousness for so long. Because contradictions create what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. Two things can't both be true, and the human mind hates that. We want a coherent ending, even if we have to invent one. In this case, the contradictions were not minor. They were structural. Dropped off at the hotel versus not returning. Left on a beach versus different locations. Accident versus violence. Buried under a foundation versus later described as worthless information. One of the reasons those contradictions matter is because each version implies a different set of accomplices, actions, and logistics. If she died accidentally and was hidden, you might expect help from friends. If she was killed intentionally, you might expect a more deliberate concealment plan. If she was taken elsewhere, you might expect vehicles, timelines, coordination. So contradictions don't just create suspense. They create investigative branches. And those branches have consequences. Because each time law enforcement commits resources to one branch, they are not committing them to another. That's why early decisions and early missteps can haunt a case forever. If the first 72 hours are spent chasing the wrong version, you lose witnesses, lose environmental evidence, lose the chance to find a body before the landscape changes. And in Aruba, an island with constant human movement, those losses could happen fast. So what were the investigators up against? They had international pressure. They had a fast-changing environment. They had potential language and cultural barriers. They had intense media presence. And they had at least one person of interest whose story kept moving. Now, to be fair, inconsistencies can happen for reasons other than guilt. Young people lie to avoid consequences. People lie because they think they'll be blamed. People lie because they were doing something illegal and don't want that exposed. But in Natalee's case, the lies weren't about a minor embarrassment. They were about the last known hours of a missing person. That changes the moral calculus. It also changes how the public reacts. And this is the part of the story that's uncomfortable, but important. The public reaction shaped the investigation. It shaped the perception of Aruba. It shaped the lives of witnesses. It shaped the long-term ecosystem of contributes, scammers, amateur detectives, and professional opportunists. The case became a global phenomenon at a time when modern true crime media was accelerating, when cable news and tabloid coverage could run a story 24/7 and fill the empty space with speculation. In that kind of environment, the absence of information becomes content, and content demands new angles. So the case generates theories. Some theories are reasonable. Some theories are wild. Some theories are harmful. And for Natalee's family, every new theory can feel like a fresh wound. Because a theory isn't just a story when your child is missing. It's a possible map showing where to look. It's a possible future you have to imagine, then live with. That's why we have to treat theories like tools, not like entertainment. A theory is useful only if it explains the known facts better than competing theories, and if it can be tested. So let's test the three main pathways in a disciplined way. Pathway 1, voluntary disappearance. This pathway has always been the least supported by what most people know about the case. Natalee was on a supervised trip. She had plans. There is no clear evidence she intended to vanish, and disappearances during vacations without any financial preparation are rare. Could it happen? In abstract, yes. People sometimes flee. But the question is whether there's evidence suggesting that. And in this case, the more prominent facts point away from voluntary disappearance. The last seen leaving with locals in a car, the lack of confirmed return, the lack of later sightings, and the later behavior of Van der Sloot all make voluntary disappearance an uphill argument. So investigators and observers largely focus on pathways 2 and 3. Pathway 2, accident, likely involving alcohol and the ocean. This pathway has always been one of the clean explanations people return to when they're exhausted by the contradictions. It's psychologically easier. It doesn't require believing in a conspiracy. It doesn't require imagining brutality. It suggests a tragedy without a villain. But the problem is the behavior after. If someone realizes a person is in danger, most people call for help. Even if you're afraid of being blamed, most people call for help. In an accident scenario, you need a reason why no help was called, why the story shifted, and why years later there was an extortion attempt involving false information. An accident can lead to panic. Panic can lead to concealment. But concealment for years, with repeated lies, and then a money scheme showing worthless information suggests something darker than a simple drowning. Still, we can't completely rule out a version where something began as an accident and became a cover-up. That happens in real cases. People make one bad decision and then stack more bad decisions on top of it. So the accident pathway is not impossible, but it has to explain the long-term pattern. Pathway 3, violence with concealment, possibly involving more than one person. This is the pathway that many people believe in, largely because it explains contradictions as intentional manipulation rather than confusion. It also aligns with later events in van der Sloot's life, including a conviction for murder in Peru. And it aligns with the 2023 account he provided in a legal setting, an account that describes violence and disposal in the ocean. But the question within this pathway becomes, did he act alone or did others help? This is one of the most sensitive parts of the case, because naming alleged accomplices without proof can harm people permanently. So we're not going to do that. What we can do is speak in structural terms. If the last known sighting involved more than one man, and if a death occurred, it's reasonable for investigators to explore whether multiple people had knowledge of it, whether multiple people contributed to concealment, or whether some people participated only in the early movement, like driving, leaving a location, or creating a shared story afterward. But exploring a possibility is not the same as accusing an individual. And it's also possible, legally and factually, that a person could be involved at one point and not involved at another point. That's why these cases are so difficult. Now, I want to address something about the 2023 confession that can be overlooked. When van der Sloot gave his account, it came in the context of a plea agreement tied to extortion and wire fraud, not a murder prosecution. That means the legal incentives are different. In a murder case, a confession can lead to a conviction and a severe sentence. The incentive to lie might be reduced because the cost is immediate. In an extortion case, especially with a sentence running concurrently with an existing long sentence in Peru, the incentive structure can be more complicated. A person might perceive they have less to lose, or they may perceive they can shape how the world remembers them. They may also believe that giving a shocking account finally ends the attention, or at least shifts it. And that's where we need to be psychologically honest about what closure means in cases like this. Closure is often framed as a confession, a body, a conviction. But for families, closure can be different. Sometimes it's simply the end of uncertainty, even if the ending is brutal. In public statements after the 2023 proceeding, Beth Holloway described finally receiving the answers she'd been searching for. That matters because it shows what this confession did for the family emotionally, regardless of whether it could ever be tested like courtroom evidence in Aruba. But emotional closure and legal closure are not the same thing. And because this is a true crime story with real people, we can hold both truths at once. Now let's take a breath and do another clarity anchor. Here's what we can say with confidence. Natalee Holloway disappeared on May 30th, 2005, while on a graduation trip in Aruba. She was last seen leaving a bar with local young men, including Joran van der Sloot. Surveillance footage did not show her returning to the holiday in that night. Van der Sloot and others were arrested in 2005 and later released without charges. The case remained unsolved for years, with recurring attention spikes driven by new claims and media. In 2010, van der Sloot was implicated in a scheme to obtain money from Natalee's mother in exchange for information about her remains, information later described as worthless. In 2010, he killed Stephanie Flores in Peru and was convicted for that murder. In 2023, he pleaded guilty in the U.S. to extortion and wire fraud charges tied to the 2010 scheme, and as part of that process, he provided an account of killing Natalee and disposing of her body in the ocean. Aruban authorities have continued to treat the case as open, seeking U.S. documents to evaluate next steps. That's the spine. Everything else, every theory, every rumor, every whispered certainty, hangs off that spine. Now, if you've made it this far, you deserve something more than the headline version. So here's the deeper question. Why were there never charges in 2005? There are only a few explanations, and none of them are satisfying. 1. Law enforcement believed they had suspects but lacked physical evidence and corroboration to meet a prosecutorial standard. 2. Investigative errors, delays, or lost opportunities weakened the case early. 3. The truth was more complex than the early narrative, potentially involving multiple movements, multiple stories, and a body never recovered. Or 4. Some combination of all three. The absence of charges is not proof of innocence. It's proof that the system could not prove the case. And that's why contradictions matter so much. Because contradictions are often how you build a case when you don't have a body. You build it by showing that someone lied about a key fact, and then proving that lie matters. The lie becomes evidence. But for a lie to become evidence, it has to be connected to something objective. In Natalee's case, some objective anchors existed, like surveillance. But the deeper objective anchors, like physical traces, recovered remains, or a verified crime scene, never emerged publicly. And that's what kept this case in the realm of suspicion for so long. Now, we need to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough: the difference between a media case and an investigative case. A media case is built around visibility. A media case thrives on updates. A media case turns a disappearance into a story with villains, heroes, twists, and cliffhangers. An investigative case is built around slow, unglamorous work, interviews, records, searches, and the boring persistence of checking what can be checked. Those two cases can overlap. Sometimes the media attention helps. Sometimes it floods the system with tips, but it can also distort priorities. It can push investigators toward high-visibility searches rather than low-visibility verification. It can pressure officials into premature statements. It can turn witnesses into performers. It can also poison jury pools if a case ever goes to trial. So when we ask why this case never got charges, we also have to ask whether the spotlight helped or hurt. Here's another comment question I want you to consider. Do you think wall-to-wall media coverage helps missing person cases more often than it hurts? Or do you think it turns investigations into public theater? There's no universal answer, but this case is one of the clearest examples we have of how the spotlight becomes part of the crime. Now, around the midpoint of this episode, I want to acknowledge something. If this kind of careful breakdown is valuable to you, please tap like. It helps more people find this kind of ethical, evidence-minded true crime. And it tells the algorithm you want more than rumors. Now, let's examine the contradictions more systematically, because this is where your original observation becomes the heart of the story. Van der Sloot's story changed across years, and each change served a purpose at the time. Early on, a dropped at the hotel story reduces culpability and reduces the need to answer follow-up questions. Later, a left on the beach story places responsibility on the victim's environment or choices, not on him. Later still, in the context of an alleged extortion scheme, an accidental death framing can minimize moral and legal weight while still selling closure to a family desperate for answers. And then, in 2023, an account describing violence can serve a different purpose: finality, control, a last chapter written by the person who held the pen for too long. But there's a deeper reason shifting stories matter. Because shifting stories are a strategy to prevent verification. If you keep changing the location, investigators can't dig in one place long enough to find evidence. If you keep changing the sequence, witnesses can't match your story to their memory. If you keep changing the why, the public debates motive instead of focusing on evidence. It becomes a hall of mirrors. And it's worth noting that hall of mirrors doesn't just trap the public. It traps investigators too. Now, one of the most chilling aspects of this case is not a single claim. It's the pattern. A pattern where a family is kept in suspense. A pattern where attention is leveraged. A pattern where answers are offered, then revoked. A pattern where the absence of a body becomes a weapon. That pattern is part of why this case remains emotionally potent for so many people who followed it. Not because it was mysterious in a fun way, but because it felt like watching someone's life be held hostage by uncertainty. And it's part of why the 2023 statement, regardless of its verifiability, mattered emotionally. It broke the pattern of endless ambiguity, at least in the sense of providing an account that didn't immediately shift again. But we still have to ask, what doesn't it answer? It doesn't produce Natalee's remains. It doesn't create a conviction in the jurisdiction where she disappeared. It doesn't fully clarify whether anyone else knew. It doesn't repair the lost time. And it doesn't undo the way this case became a cultural artifact, shaping how people think about travel safety, missing person investigations, and the media's role in tragedy. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place that feels unsatisfying but honest. There is no perfect ending here. There is only a set of truths that can sit beside each other. Natalee was a real person whose life was cut off from her future. Her family lived through years of uncertainty. The world watched and sometimes helped and sometimes harmed by turning the case into a spectacle. A man with a documented history of violence and manipulation became the central figure in the story, not because he was convicted for Natalee's death, but because he was last seen with her and repeatedly changed his story. And in 2023, he provided an account that, if true, explains why her body was never found and why the case was so hard to prosecute. But the absence of physical closure means the case remains, in a way, unresolved, because the most human form of justice is not just knowing what happened, but bringing someone home. Now, I want to end where we began, with Natalee. The most important thing we can do, ethically, is resist turning her into a symbol, and remember she was a teenager on a trip, with a family waiting for her return. The tragedy of this case isn't just the disappearance. It's the long aftermath, the way grief became public property, the way hope was repeatedly exploited, and the way truth became something one person could claim to sell. If you take reassurance from anything here, let it be this. When we tell these stories with care, without rumor laundering, without sensationalism, we reduce the power of the people who benefit from chaos. And we honor the people who were lost by insisting on reality, not myth. If you're new here and you want more long-form investigations that prioritize victims, facts, and clarity, consider subscribing. And if you want another case that shows how contradictions can shape an entire investigation, I'll link one at the end. Before you go, I'll ask one last question. After everything you now know, after years of shifting stories, and then a statement delivered under a plea agreement, do you believe a confession without physical evidence can ever truly close a case? Tell me what you think, and tell me why. I read these comments, and in cases like this, the why matters just as much as the answer.